Good day, economics audience. The purpose of this presentation is to investigate the causes and solutions to something the U.S. economy and the world economy has not had to deal with in over 4 decades, and that is inflation. Hence the title of this presentation, Inflation is Back. The Bureau of Economic Analysis and our central bank, the Federal Reserve, both track the average price level in the economy. There are a few different measures of inflation. This chart displays the most widely adopted measure of inflation, known as the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a market basket of goods and services purchased by the typical urban consumer, aka the stuff everyone has to buy, and we track the changes in average price level year over year. That basket includes food, energy, education, entertainment, housing, consumer durables, pretty much everything under the sun that people have to buy. And as I stated, the federal government and our nation's central bank track the average price level over time. Remember, the CPI is an average. So the CPI, Consumer Price Index, is actually reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Why do we have two graphs or lines across our time frame here from 1975 through 2022? The red line is the CPI, and the blue line is what's called the core CPI, or the Consumer Price Index without the volatile two sectors of food and energy. Notice the high level of inflation in the 70s and early 80s. We will discuss that throughout this presentation. Then also notice the tame level of prices from 1990 through this most recent pandemic era, basically from the start of 1990 through 2020. The world didn't really have to deal much with any unwarranted increases in price level. This trend, however, came to an end with the end of the pandemic, and that will be the focus of this presentation. Because it will be relative to our discussion later, it is important to provide some basic macroeconomic theory, as it will be relevant to our discussion later. This is a graph of the business cycle. So on the horizontal axis, we are measuring time. Think of the point of origin, or where the X and Y axis meet, as 1950, or the start of the modern economic era, and the far right as today, so 2022. So over that span of 72 years, that's the time frame. Measured on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is the level of real output, or GDP adjusted for inflation, real GDP. So over the long run, our economy grows at roughly 2.75%. That's our average level of economic growth. That's the growth trend line against the backdrop of our long run average growth, or rising real GDP in the long run. We go through business cycles, which are periods of economic expansion when real GDP is positive, and then a temporary moment in time when there is a peak, and then the dreaded recession, where we have 6 months or longer of dropping or falling, declining real output. Eventually things stop getting bad, and that's the trough, and then things pick up again. The point of going over this business cycle graph for this presentation, generally speaking, inflation is more of a problem during the strength of an economic expansion and not during a recession. And there was a typical understanding of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. In other words, unemployment was an issue during a recession, and inflation was more of an economic worry during the strong segment of the economic expansion. What causes inflation? This is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. We do not have time or inclination to go over all the details of the graph, but suffice to say, it demonstrates graphically macroeconomic equilibrium at a point in time. As pictured currently, This is what we refer to as full employment domestic output. In other words, everything is perfect in the economy. The amount of total demand, consumer expenditures, gross business investment, government expenditures, and net exports is at equilibrium with aggregate supply, which is the total amount of real output that producers want to make available for sale at a given point in time. So this would represent full employment domestic output, aka our economy growing just under 3%, unemployment at about 4%, and price level, which we're most interested in here, at about 2%. If spending gets excessive, this creates what's called demand pool inflation, aka too much money chasing too few goods. Remember that term, as it will be investigated later. Too much money chasing too few goods when spending exceeds the economy's ability to produce. There is, my friends, another cause of inflation, and this one is even more dreaded. It's called cost push inflation. So imagine same scenario, the economy is at full employment domestic output. We're growing near or at our long-range average growth rate of about 2.75%. Unemployment's not a problem, we're at 4%. And price level is stable at about 2%, so we have 2% inflation. And then we have a negative supply shock. The aggregate supply shock shifts left, which causes output to decline from QF to Q1, which means unemployment goes up, but at the same time, the economy is experiencing an increase in the price level or inflation. This happened in the 1970s, as we just looked on that chart earlier in this presentation about the high level of inflation during that period. Most, not all economists believe that this was caused by the supply shock of much higher oil prices. Now, this same supply shock could be happening, and a matter of fact is happening, because of the global glut in supply chains post-pandemic. So keep this graph in mind as we move forward as well. Some of the inflation that we're experiencing in 2022 is demand pull inflation, and some is caused by cost push inflation. The world is currently dealing with an increase in price level, aka inflation, well above our desired 2% target. How did we get to this dreaded level of increases in price level, aka unwarranted, undesired inflation? Let's take a step back to April 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. An article published by The Economist, COVID-19 could lead to return of inflation eventually. So it's interesting how this article predicted in many ways what we are now experiencing. So the article began by discussing the idea that there's much uncertainty about the economic future, the economic conditions of the world 1 to 5 years post-pandemic. As you can imagine, it was a scary time for all, and it was not something people in the world of economics had dealt with at any point over the last 100 years. So it was not easy to make accurate predictions, but people in that business are, for better or for worse, asked to do that very thing, is to make some prediction about where we're headed in the future. So in the past, in the 1970s, as we saw in that chart, inflation was an economic worry. And as we describe, there was this understanding of inflation being caused by too much money chasing too few goods. But inflation as an economic worry seemed to be put on the back burner and something that was for only the history books. Because for 4 decades, the globe, the United States, and other modern industrialized economies grew at pretty respectable rates of economic output with meager or mild or negligible price level. Matter of fact, Japan's dealt with problems of deflation. So for better or for worse, we really haven't had to deal with inflation for quite a long time. But the article predicted what we're now seeing has unfortunately come to fruition, that supply chain interruptions could and have indeed translated into shortages in shops, causing higher price levels. Now, here's where the article also made some dire warnings, which have come to fruition, that the massive fiscal stimulus and monetary expansion. So what does that mean? In response to the unwanted and inevitable shutdown of the economy because of the pandemic, to put money in people's pockets, governments around the world responded with huge fiscal stimulus, aka checks to people who were out of work and monies for businesses who would otherwise fail, massive amounts of fiscal stimulus. At the same time, the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world provided enormous amounts of monetary expansion, aka monetary stimulus, meaning that they reduced interest rates to the lowest level possible and participated in quantitative easing, buying all kinds of financial assets, in essence, increasing the money supply across the globe in every modern industrialized country. And the article did predict that these two forces, fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus, could add to the potential inflation fire. So for instance, the ECB or European Central Bank, they expanded their balance sheet by 12%, and our central bank, the Federal Reserve, geez, a whopping 40% increase in our balance sheets, right? So massive monetary expansion by these central banks. So the article looked at what happened in 2008 and said, well, look, the Federal Reserve and federal governments around the world, central banks, and they provided the same monetary and fiscal stimulus in 2008. That didn't cause any inflation. So maybe it was possible to add monetary and fiscal stimulus to the global economy without causing inflation. But there's a worry this could happen. The article alludes to what's called the reverse of the Keynesian supply shock. In the Keynesian world, there was a significant drop in demand, which put deflationary pressure on price levels. So during the Great Depression, the United States and other economies suffered through deflation. The article discussed an interesting idea called the reverse of the Keynesian supply shock, where instead of demand dropping, supply dropped significantly, which would put upward pressure on prices, aka that cost push inflation we investigated just a few minutes ago in that slide that graphed the idea of cost push inflation, or a leftward shift the aggregate supply curve. Fast forward to today, another article from The Economist. After getting inflation so wrong, can the Fed now get it right? Is the title of this article. So the Fed sort of missed the boat here. Right? Many economists and people in the world of finance have criticized the nation's central bank, United States Central Bank, for not being more on top of this issue and not getting ahead of the rapid increase in price level. So, as we said before, that there was this, we would say, uneasy understanding that inflation was something in history, something to be studied in academics, but something that never really affected current policy, mostly because, as we stated, global economies didn't have to deal with inflation for the past 4 decades. But the combination of generous fiscal and monetary policy, snarled supply chains, and tight job markets, in addition to something we didn't see coming, which is the war in Ukraine, have all added fuel to the inflation fire, to the point now where in this past March, the increase in price level was measured at 8.5%. 8.5% inflation is the highest in 4 decades. So, this delayed response by our nation's central bank, right? Well, they did nothing about a potential increase in the price level, but now they've made this dramatic about face. So this recent change of course, what will that have as far as the impact on inflation? Well, let's talk about first the mistake, right? So the plan is for the Fed to, in 2022, move interest rates up by a full 2 percentage points. This will be the steepest incline in interest rates in better than a quarter century. So that's the plan now. But the question is, How or why did the Fed get this so wrong? So the article outlined 3 reasons: failure of imagination, this thing called the technical trap, and institutional inertia. So what do we mean by failure of imagination? Well, as it says here, that the Fed, they just didn't see this coming, right? The idea that price levels remain elevated post-pandemic, it just seemed like, well, we haven't dealt with inflation for the longest time. It didn't happen in 2008 after the financial crisis when we added all this stimulus. But the article explained in a clear and concise way that the pandemic was much more like a natural disaster than it was the financial crisis recession of 2008, where it hits, it does massive damage, but the recovery is much quicker. So the Fed really didn't think about that or have the imagination to foresee a rapid recovery by the US and other global economies. This next idea is kind of interesting, called the technical trap. And here's what happened, is that the Fed's been targeting inflation at 2% for the longest time. And inflation has been below 2% for quite a long time. So the Fed thought maybe we can get away with allowing price level or inflation to run hot for some time to make up for the periods when it was colder. And therefore we'll get to our average over time of 2% inflation. Right? In many ways, the Fed tied their own hands behind their back and should have been ready to tighten earlier. They just didn't tighten enough. Right? The last one, institutional inertia, the idea that almost you could think of as groupthink. So the Fed had, at the beginning of the pandemic, promised this open-ended asset buying program, aka QE, quantitative easing. And the committees on the Fed all bought into this idea. So when the Fed opened up this can of monetary policy worms, they then became nervous about how to end it. So you take these 3 factors and they led to what we would say is almost paralysis by analysis. The Fed letting rates get out, letting inflation get out of hand, not getting ahead of this economic problem. If we look at this chart on the right, it says lifting off median projection for the Fed funds rate. So the Fed funds rate is the interest rate that our nation's central bank uses to control the money supply. You can see how it was extremely low in 2020, Q3, Q4, Q1, right? At its lowest rate possible. Most economists and people in the world of finance believe that by the end of this year, the Fed's fund rate will be somewhere between 2 and 3%. That demonstrates that massive increase in the Fed funds rate referred to in the article. So we know inflation is an issue today. The question is, how long will inflation continue to be a problem? So this article from the Wall Street Journal, Will Inflation Stay High for Decades, spends a good deal of time analyzing predictions by this gentleman, Mr. Goodhart, who has a theory that we are in for a long and undesired bout with inflation. And here's how his theory goes. He said that for a long time there's this glut of inexpensive labor. Inexpensive labor kept prices and wages down for decades, and that era of plentiful labor, which kept prices and wages down for a long time, 40 years or so, is giving way to a new era where we're going to have worker shortages, and worker shortages causing higher prices. And he sort of puts this demarcation in the sand, saying the coronavirus pandemic will mark the divide. And the divide of what? The deflationary forces of the 30 or 40 years before the pandemic, and the resurgence of inflation over what he sees as the next 20 years or 2 decades. And he calls this the great demographic reversal. And this is what he argues. So Goodhart, he argues that the low inflation that the global economies experienced in the 1990s, it wasn't any genius of monetary policy. It wasn't as if we had these astute central bankers. It was simple supply and demand, that hundreds of millions of inexpensive workers from Europe or Eastern Europe and China, right, they well, they were there to globalize the economy, which pushed down wages and prices of exported products. So simple supply and demand. Millions and millions of workers from China and Eastern Europe means that global labor supply increases significantly, meaning that the price of labor, aka wages, declines significantly, which means the price of exports goes down. Then he makes a shocking observation that the working age population of advanced economies will actually shrink for the first time since WW2, since World War II. And on top of this declining workforce because of the aging population, birth rates are also declining, right? And the world's biggest economy is one of the biggest worries, as China's working age population will shrink by almost 1/5 or 20% over the next 30 years. Evidence to support Mr. Goodhart's theory. Thank you, Wall Street Journal. We can see this chart here shows China and higher income economies, and it shows working age populations. And you can see that a significant increase in working age populations between 1980 and 2020, and then the projected decline of these working age populations. Again, market forces, supply and demand. Less workers means higher wages. Some additional ideas about Mr. Goodhart's theory. So it's a pretty straightforward economic argument that scarce labor will therefore push up wages, and higher wages will lead to higher price levels, right? And that this is also interesting that in an effort to offset this issue, businesses manufacturing and will manufacture and invest more locally, right, to offset this labor shortage. In addition, this nationalist and geopolitical pressures will also curb global supply chains. So if you know Economics 101 suggests that international trade and globalization typically is good for all participants as production goes to nations where the least cost method of production produces certain goods and trades for other goods. But this trend of more local manufacturing will actually push wages and prices higher because production costs will increase. And he also argues that the local workers will have more bargaining power to ask bosses for higher wages. So another issue that he identifies is the idea that higher prices will then induce a significant decline in global savings, and that older people who have money saved, right, they'll have to pay more for goods and services, particularly healthcare, and therefore they will, in general, older people consume more than they produce. So this will also lead to shortage of output and higher price levels. So if we collectively take all of these forces we just discussed, that's going to push interest rates higher. And we know from the investment demand curve, Economics 101, that higher interest rates mean less business investment. Less business investment means even less job growth or slower job growth. So interest rates higher, slower economic growth, less jobs. So another interesting aspect of Goodhart's theory, he says that there's a major change in economic thinking, that too much money chasing too few goods is no longer the mantra for inflation. He's all about this supply chain issue, right? So he says that people in the know, economists in the know, that idea of too much money chasing too few goods, that's lost favor with those in the economic think tank. He also says that there is no correlation that unemployment or lower unemployment drives inflation higher. That idea is also valid. Now, is Mr. Goodhart correct? Possibly, but one major criticism of his idea is something of a real-life study. Japan has an aging population, and matter of fact, Japan's population has been aging for decades now, and they've actually dealt more with deflationary issues or pressures than they have inflation. So Japan having more retirees, right? It has not fueled a worker shortage and inflation. It's induced the opposite problem. Hope you enjoyed listening to this interesting presentation on inflation, and it's hopefully been informative as to the issues now facing the globe on this macroeconomic event.